Zombie Jesus, I've heard the young people say in their characteristic, ironic speech, talking about the resurrection of Jesus in a half-serious way and a half-mocking way, as if Jesus maybe is indeed risen from the dead and his body is out of the grave, stumbling about as if he were a character out of The Walking Dead. But that is not what Christians mean when we say Jesus is risen from the dead. Instead, we mean something which is overflowing with life and love, the grace of God, the favor of God given to us. One of the characteristic ways in which the New Testament authors speak of Jesus risen from the dead is as if they encounter in him not only Jesus alive, but the source of the forgiveness of sins. It might sound odd to us who have maybe a simpler and more childish notion of sin. We think of sin as some offense we've given, and the forgiveness of sin often as simply a waiving or a forgetting of the sin. But for first century Jewish men and women who had a much more acute sense of God's commands and God's purposes in them, they were very aware of the gap between who they were and who God had called them to be. And so when they speak of that experience of the forgiveness of sins coming from Jesus, they are speaking of that sense in which God is now accomplishing in Jesus all that they had failed to do. All the loving obedience to God's commands that they had failed at, all the loving community that they had been commanded to build up among their brothers and sisters in God's people, all that they had failed at was accomplished there as well. When they met the risen Jesus, when they encountered Jesus alive, they encountered at the same time that reassuring and overflowing love of God, convincing them in an instant that God's love was more than all their failure, that in God's love, all the loving obedience they had failed at was now fulfilled. The law was fulfilled, and all the loving community that they had failed to build up was now also completed in the church that Jesus was establishing, that loving community of adopted brothers and sisters in Jesus Christ. Overall, their experience of the risen Jesus was one of that perfection and completion of God's love in them. And so it was for them a very happy Easter indeed when Jesus was risen from the dead, because they experienced just the seeing of Jesus as the reassurance and the fulfillment of God's promise of life and love and joy for all eternity. Jesus is risen from the dead. Happy Easter.